of where we're up to this week. So this week is week number 2. Our whole class, this whole session of 8 classes, we're calling Essentials of Buddhist Practice, just as a nice starting point. Last week we talked about the Buddha and awakening. So in particular we talked about kind of the story of the Buddha's life. And I think it's always an important starting point because that story is kind of like the Buddhist ideal. You know, the Buddha himself kind of embodies that. But what we're going to get into next is going to be a bit less sort of narrative storytelling and a bit more into kind of more technical, slightly philosophical. So this week we're going to be talking about, as you can see, the law of karma, cause and effect. So this is a very important concept within Buddhism, and not just Buddhism, but a number of other Indian traditions, though there are definitely differences. And cause and effect here, I mean, karma is one, the law of karma and the results of karma is one example of what I mean by cause and effect, but we can also talk about it in a far more general sense as well. Next week we'll be talking about the Four Noble Truths, where we're going to have to deal with cause and effect again, and then we're going to get into sort of the practices, so to speak, from what we're calling the ethical lifestyle, and then we're going to have 2 classes on how to meditate and meditation techniques, and then as we culminate in what we call wisdom, so that kind of wisdom is the goal, and then the last week we're going to talk about the Bodhisattva path, just to remind you, refresh you on where this fits into our whole course. Okay. Now, I've got some very simple notes here from myself. Now, I think maybe Varya, you mentioned last week maybe we can get these up on the online. Well, I could do it now, but I don't want to sit and the teachers in front of the class playing with my phone. I can put it up in the break maybe. But for now, don't worry, we'll have it up on the board. Okay, so I'm sure that even people that have not even heard of Buddhism, at least English language speakers, will have heard of this term karma. Okay, it's become, you can now find it in English dictionaries, it's a very common term. Though one of the first things I do like to point out is the way that it's used now in English is just wrong, and I don't mean wrong in the sense of like, oh, I'm a Buddhist scholar, and I don't know that you're wrong. I don't mean in that sense. It's the way we use karma now in colloquial English is we use it to refer to the result. You know, you go out and find your car, and you've got a parking ticket, and you go, hey dude, bad karma. Okay, and we're talking about this bad result. But the first thing to point out with karma, as a case of cause and effect, is karma is the action, it's the cause, not the result. Right? So that's something that I always like to point out. Now, when we're talking about then this cause and result, I'd like to share with you 3 terms. I'm going to get a little bit technical. The first one is just this term, karma. And then we've got 2 other, and I'm going to give you the Sanskrit words, but I'll tell you what they mean, so don't worry. Which kind of mean the same thing, but they're just like 2 different terms. One's called vipaka, and the other one is called phala. Again, karma, this basic term, would be best translated as action. It comes from this verb kri, karoti, to do. You do something. He does something. So just like in English, if you say do, it's just the most general verb that you can possibly use, right? Or in Chinese, like 做, you 做什么, right? It's just this action word. Okay. We'll get into details in a moment. These 2 terms are kind of a bit interesting. Vipaka means like maturation, or even, we're going to get into this metaphor in a minute, ripening, for something to ripen. Like fruit, and it really is fruit because the word phala means fruit. Now in Chinese, of course, it's termed 果, which is literally fruit, but just in general Chinese, if you want want to talk about a result, you talk about a 结果, right? What happens, right? The result, the effect of something. So you can see, particularly from these two terms, that action here, if you go back into this really old Indian usage, a number of scholars, and I tend to agree, would say that this basic term for action or doing, or you could even say like work, in a way, work. And it may have been particularly used with respect to what we call like farm work, agricultural work. Ancient India, like many old societies, the basic work is work in the fields. You do some work, and then what do you get out of your work? You get your fruit, right? The fruits of your labor, if I put it in some old-fashioned English expression, right? The fruit of your labor. Labor is just work. So this points out a really important metaphor to us, which is this metaphor commonly used to describe karma as the action and the result in terms of growing something, right? And you also will later see, particularly in a type of Mahayana Buddhism, very common in Chinese Buddhism, the idea of seeds and planting seeds and getting the results, getting the fruit from your seed. Okay. But before we just get into that, let's just go back to this term karma and point out another really, really important, I guess you could say like a definition of it. So the Buddha was asked to kind of define this term karma because it was used in India before the Buddhist time. So in Brahmanism, so like the old roots of what we now call Hinduism, the basic religious action they used was a ritual, chanting mantras, which are like the names of the gods. They're like prayers or hymns to the gods. Often they would have like use fire sacrifice, a fire ritual, and so forth. But within that, karma was your ritual. If you do the ritual properly, that is karma. And by properly, it means you follow all the rules and you pronounce the mantra correctly. That was super, super important in India, that you pronounce the mantra correctly. And these young Brahmin boys at a very young age would learn the language perfectly and precisely. Very impressive. But the Buddha wasn't really so much interested in ritual action and the results of ritual action. He said, so what is this? And he used a term called cetana. We can maybe translate it as intention. Intention. So karma isn't just any kind of action, it is a kind of intentional, or you could say like intentional, or even, if you like, will, a kind of willed action. So that means, for example, the classic example of there's ants on the floor, and maybe you are, you're on your phone, what an example would be, walking along, looking at your cell phone, and you are stepping on these ants. But you're stepping on them unknowingly, unwittingly, you don't even recognize that you're doing it. So is this karma? No, it's not. As opposed to, oh, ants. Got them ants. That's intentional action. So, key point here is it's not just action in terms of the physical thing you do. The whole idea of it being intentional or willed depends on that mental attitude behind it. Okay, so that's really a key part of what we mean here by karma. So it's kind of this definition, intention or will. So kind of, it's like, it's the thought that counts. Okay. Though you have to be careful because it doesn't just mean they're like, oh, well, I had a good intention. Is good intention like enough to make karma good karma? Yeah, we're going to get to that in a second. Okay, so far so good? The basic concept. Okay, I'm going to
tradition in India, they like doing a ritual is a karma. And then, like you say, Buddha is not interested about that. Can you explain it more about this part? Because since in like in Veda tradition or in Indian tradition, that is a long-term history, things, and it's that for the Buddhism, how the Buddha and how the Buddhists think about that. No.
Well, the difference here is mainly that if you do the ritual correctly, you get the result, and thus purity in the Brahmanic sense means doing a ritual correctly, which has nothing to do with whether you're a nice person. You could be doing a ritual which is a curse, and if you do the ritual correctly, then you're pure. And the Buddha is saying, well, no, if you're like cursing someone, you want to destroy them, right? You want something bad to happen to them. That's not purity. That evil intent that you have is impurity. But what about someone else who's not a Brahmin at all, and they just do some good deed, but they're not doing a ritual? Are they, does that mean that they're not pure? Well, they are pure. Purity comes down to the mental state behind it, and it's purity. We're going to talk about some of those in a minute, rather than your ability to follow a ritual according to the rules of the ritual. So that was the big difference. He gave it what we would call an ethical definition of purity, rather than a ritual definition of purity. Okay, so when we talk about doing these actions, because it's such a core idea in Buddhism, there's lots of different ways to analyze it and different angles to look at it by. So we're just going to look at a couple of those. The first one is the way in which you act, right? So what they call 3 doors. Body, speech, and mind. Now, of course, isn't speech kind of an act of body? I mean, in the modern way that we think in English, yes it is. Though again, in India, speech was given quite a different emphasis. Again, this might be due to Brahmanism. They believe that like speech and sound was this like eternal quality. The universe was brought into existence by Brahma, the god Brahma's speech. Like the mantra, the speech creates it. So they kind of separated speech and body into 2 different categories. Okay. Now of these 3, while any of these can be intentional, it's important to note that it is mind that is really the critical one. Now again, this was a difference between Buddhism and not just the Brahmanic traditions, but also say the Jaina traditions. The Jainas believed that, for example, so the Jainas were this other tradition, just literally 10 or 20 years earlier than Buddhism, that had a lot of commonalities, but they also had some differences. They believed that one's physical actions were far more important than one's, say, mental actions. So in their regard, if you stepped on those bugs, but you didn't know that you were stepping on them, you've still made a big mistake here. But the Buddha's argument is saying that, why is mind the critical one? Because one's physical actions and speech are driven by mind, right? So when we define karma as intention, intention is a mental thing, right? It's not a physical thing. So in a sense, in a narrow sense, karma really comes down to the mind. But it can be also enacted through the way in which we act, the way in which we speak. But then we can also keep in mind too, you can commit karma without doing or saying anything. So it might be a case of, for some reason, like maybe you get really angry, but you're like restraining yourself, like, don't say anything, don't kill that person. You might not have done anything here or said anything here, but inside there might be a lot going on. So in the Buddhist sense, we've still got some mental karma going on. Yep.
Wouldn't that be not intentional, and you're intentionally not acting on thoughts you weren't intentionally having? Like, the intentional part of that seems like
Okay, this might be a bit of a problem with the English term intention. That's kind of the closest thing I can come to translating that word. But the very fact that you've got that, like say in that example, you're really angry with someone. Okay, so that anger is like ill will, is what we're meaning by intention. But you're right, the very fact that then you're restraining yourself, that would kind of be a good thing, right? So it would be better to like, I've got the anger, but I'm gonna just not lose my cool. Okay, you're still at that anger. Would be better than you've got that anger and you just strangle someone or whatever. Okay, yeah. But, so part of the problem, I think, maybe the intention.
Yeah.
Intention. Yeah. So these are what we call then 3 doors. The critical thing is the mind is really the crucial one here. Now, when it comes down to the mind, and this idea that the basic idea of karma comes down to this intention, it's also really up to the mind to decide what we might want to call its like ethical value. Ethical value or ethical qualities. And this is a really important kind of way of dividing up different mental acts and then the physical and verbal actions that follow from that. The simplest way is to put into 3 basic categories, shall we say. Wholesome, unwholesome, and let's just say neutral, the last one. Though it's worth pointing out that this term wholesome could also be translated, I never know how to spell skillful, I never know is it 1 L in the front or 2 L's. Anyway, sorry if I'm doing typos here. Wholesome or skillful, it's the same word, but it's just like the original word. It's got these 2 ideas are both kind of fused into that term, kusala, and then the opposite, akusala. So this kind of wholesome, unwholesome, or neutral, it's kind of, it's an ethical value that we're giving to it. And we can also say skillful as well. Now, what kind of mental states? Like I said, it's the mental states that decide which of these 3 basic categories it fits into. Now, the mental state here in Buddhist thought, Buddhist psychology, a lot of time and effort is spent into talking about different mental states. Okay? We're going to get into it in a bit more detail when we get into the meditation, the 2 meditation classes that we're going to have. Even then, we'll just be touching the surface. But for now, let's talk about just a couple of them. Usually people will start from the unskillful ones first. I like to translate these terms as desire, aversion, and ignorance. Sometimes people will say like greed and anger. But I prefer desire and aversion. It's a bit of a lower threshold, so to speak. So, what do we mean? So desire and aversion. Now, note for these 2, it is, when we say desire for something or aversion to something, is working on like a sensual level. So it's like a sensual desire. You want something that is, okay, now think of our senses. What senses do we have? Okay, visual sense, auditory, olfactory, gustatory, tactile, right? And in Buddhist terms, you've also got the mind is another sense as well. So we're talking about 6 of them, okay? Eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and then mind. So if we're going to talk about, let's say, first category, sensual desire, the visual things, seeing pleasant things, and then this desire for pleasant things, right? So a classic example is, anyone want to throw out a very simple example? Television, right? Might be something pleasant to look at. What do you like to watch on television?
Hockey.
Hockey. Okay. Is it like actually pleasant to watch? It might be a bit more complicated actually. It might be a lot of like other things like your pride in your team. Might be, the actual hockey itself. I don't know, maybe you're not Canadian, I just can't understand. Okay. But, if you say something like, I mean, just most movies, I mean, the male character is always this incredibly handsome figure, and the female lead is always this incredibly beautiful figure, right? Just the very fact that these leading actors and actresses are physically attractive, right? Yeah, we like to look at attractive people. And the bad guy or bad girl might be, that's kind of weird. Sometimes the baddies can be like really ugly, but sometimes they can also be like super attractive. It's kind of interesting. Anyway, aversion would be then the flip side, right? You make the bad guy someone incredibly ugly and grotesque. So just when you look at them, it's like, ugh, a kind of aversion. They must be the baddie. The hero could never be that ugly. Right? Visual things. And the same for our other senses. We like to listen to nice music. Again, quite subjective, I know. We don't like to listen to the sound of traffic or roadworks outside your apartment at 6 a.m., right? It's painful, etc., etc. But no, we're going to put ignorance in here as well. And I just want to point that out because when we come back and we talk about karma as being intentional, we might think, yeah, well, desire is an intention, right? I want aversion, I don't want, I want to push that thing away, right? I kind of want, desire is like, I want to take something pleasant and bring it closer to me, right? Aversion is something unpleasant and I want to push it far from me. Ignorance is can be a bit more tricky, right? But ignorance is also part of this ethical evaluation of karma as well. The flip side, then, is the wholesome states. Now sometimes these are just defined as like non-desire, non-aversion, and non-ignorance. But it's worth pointing out, it sounds desire and non-desire. When they say non-desire, they don't just mean the absence of desire. They actually mean it's an actual quality in and of itself. Right? Now, you can also put it in other ways. Renunciation or like relinquishment. Right? It might be something that you find is very pleasant or dear to you, but you're not attached to it. You're willing to let it go. Yeah? So this also includes, for example, generosity. Right? As I said, desire or greed, and then the opposite would be, say, generosity. Renunciation, willing to relinquish things. Aversion, what's going to be the opposite of aversion or anger? Love, compassion, love, kindness. Sure. And the opposite of ignorance is going to be typically we say wisdom. Very Buddhists love using this term, wisdom. So you've kind of got these pairs. Now, here I'm just giving these 3 basic wholesome states and 3 basic unwholesome states, but there are definitely more. So sometimes you'll talk about the 3, right? The 3 poisons or the 3 fires or the 3 roots. Sometimes then the next step would be 5 when they add on to the unwholesome side. Typically they'll add on jealousy and pride, or sometimes doubt and pride. And then you can add on many more. Okay. The graduate class that I teach here in this very same classroom with this very same whiteboard, the class is on Abhidharma Buddhism, which was fairly early but not super early Buddhism, and it was a lot of philosophical systematization, of which talking about the mind and different mental states was super, super important. And many schools would have, literally dozens. And they also have like more categories than just these three, 5 or 6 or 7 different categories of mental states. And then in each category you've got 6 or 8 or 10 or more different nuanced mental states. Right? So there's a lot of detail to go into. But let's just stick with this for now. Now, this is the content, could be expanded. This I think kind of really holds the essentials though. Right? Chinese Tanshan Shu. Right? Desire, aversion, and ignorance. But let's just come back to our term here, wholesome, unwholesome, and skillful, unskillful. So in Chinese, classical terms is like shan and wusan. So shan typically, shan's kind of like good, as in like goody, good, wholesome, that kind of thing. But we also have the sense of skillful and unskillful. And I think this reminds us of something very important. One is mental states, these kinds of mental states, and then the actions that are driven by these mental states are skills. It's like a skill or an ability. It's not just something that's sort of this thing that just happens by itself. And like any skill, we can train it. Right? So I don't know, any of you here play any musical instruments? What do you play, John? Violin, piano. So how many years have you played the violin? You've forgotten. Okay. So can you remember the first time you picked up the violin and like, that's a horrible sound, right? You're better now, right? You make a nice sound now? Right, sure. And with skill, skilled musicians pick it up and then they're just like, oh, I'm just playing around, and everyone's like, wow, that sounds beautiful. For skills like this, we think, oh, of course, it's just, well, actually sometimes people don't. Sometimes like a musician or a sports person, like world class, and they do it. And some people look at it and say, oh, it's just natural talent. And I know a few people who have those kinds of abilities, and when others say, oh, it's just natural talent, sometimes they feel a bit like, no, like it is me practicing, 2, 4, 6, 8 hours a day, every day, for 5, 10, 20 years since I was a little kid, right? And sometimes I didn't like it, and I just kept, sure, I might have some natural ability. Some people are literally just like tone deaf, right? They just can't hear the different sounds. But it's a skill, and you can train it, and it takes a lot of commitment. So this idea of calling these mental states skillful and unskillful reminds us of something really important. All these things are things we can train ourselves in, and thus our actions can be trained in. Now we might have so-called natural ability where we maybe, even just natural ability, it's hard to say. How much is purely from like our DNA, how much is it from our parents and our environment when we're small? We can't really separate those. But the critical thing is this kind of training behind it. Now, in addition to these two, you can also have neutral things that really aren't driven by those.
So can I clarify again? So you say some mental statement is also can be skillful, can be training to attend that kind of.
All of these.
Because
you can train yourself to be angry. In theory, you could meditate on anger. You could build up your anger and nurture your anger and make yourself angrier and angrier every day. That would be pretty unskillful. So why, as we're going to get into later, from an action, what kind of result does it lead to? Right. The results of that trained anger are going to be rather nasty. Right. Not just for yourself, but also for others.
because I really like, for example, yoga chara in some way, in some insight, that kind of some statement, mental statement for me is kind of not easy to attend or easy to understanding. But you say that it can through skillful training that we can attend that kind of like mental state.
What kind of state of, I mean, are you talking about meditative states?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're not specifically talking about meditative states here, but meditative states are similar. You know, meditation isn't that just some people are born and then they just meditate and others can't. You can train in it, right? Practice makes perfect. And if you talk to anyone with someone, let's say someone who's got maybe at least 5 years, or better off if you talk to someone with like 10 or 20 years meditation experience, yeah, they'll point out to you that like it's a training, and like lots of trainings that you start at one level and you might have like you know, like the learning curve when you first start and you kind of improve very quickly, and it might kind of slowly even off, but it still has this basic, more practice will continue to just general greater improvement. So, you know, the fact that you might hear about those and think like I can't even understand what they're talking about, let alone do it, just kind of implies that, you know, our own level of training is just fairly low. It's like if you know, say use music for an example. You know, I liked music. I still like music, but I'm not very good at it. So if you give me like a world-class violinist and then just someone who's like a really pretty good violinist, I probably can't really tell you the difference. Right? My own ability is so far from, like I'm here and they're like here and here, I can't tell the difference. But if you got the world-class person to assess this person, they can tell them exactly, you're like, you're good here and here, and you're poor here and here, and you need to work on this and this. Right? So we also need to kind of develop our own ability higher to be able to assess other people's abilities. It kind of reminds me of, it's like a little bit, kind of off topic, but not really. A thing called the Kruger-Dunning effect. This is in contemporary psychology. It's often used to talk about the idea of competence and incompetence. People who are incompetent in something, like just totally unable to do something, are very, very bad at evaluating other people and themselves in that skill. So they typically rate their own ability much, much higher. If you get someone who's very, very skillful in that, they're also very, very able to assess their ability. And if you get them to evaluate themselves, they will typically underestimate their own ability until you show them to compare with someone else, and then their own assessment of their ability will be very, very accurate. So to give you an example, if you ask most people who drive a car and say, like, are you a good driver? Most people say, oh yeah, I'm a pretty good driver. So most people think that they're like above average. That cannot be true, right? People cannot all be above average. Like the definition of average, that cannot be true, just simply. Why is it? Because the people that are below average don't even know how bad they are. So they think that they're really above average. Right? So it's a similar thing here. Right? It's like if you talk to people with none of this kind of practice at all, you say, you know, are your mental states healthy and skillful? Oh yeah. I know how to look after and control my mind. Right? If you ask an expert meditator, they will tell you, oh, the mind is very difficult to control. The mind is, it's very hard to control. Now, if you just take it on their words, you're going to take the complete ignorant person and say, well, they said they're pretty good, and then the expert says it's very difficult. It's actually the other way around. So, back to the topic. This idea of skillful and unskillful, right, reminds us it's something that we need to train in. Okay, so this is talking about like ethical values. we also might talk about like neutral things. So there can be other things. Look, when I first mentioned it, I was deliberately reaching over to have something to drink. Now your basic action of having a drink, right, or just eating food, typically is going to be in your neutral category. Could be exceptions, of course. If, say, you were specifically drinking this for the taste, right? Oh, I want this taste, could be very unhealthy for me, right? But I'm doing this action not because I need liquid to keep my body alive, but purely for this sensory pleasure, then yeah, it's going to fall into our category. But it says, yeah, I'm thirsty and I need to drink something, right? Then it's a neutral action as well. So this is our kind of our ethical evaluation. The principle is fairly simple. Application, okay, is always a tricky one because any real example tends to be quite complicated. Okay. Any actual example is going to have a whole range of different mental and emotional things going on. The typical very detailed Buddhist analysis, when they're talking about, say, a desirous mental state, is just talking about even if your mind has that, say, that desirous intention for like this long, like a nanosecond, that nanosecond might be desirous. But any actual real example of doing something often has a real complex mixture of all sorts of different mental attitudes and so forth in there. So maybe let's try to think of an example. Can somebody think of some karma they have performed today? You don't have to reveal any embarrassing details, but how many of you had breakfast this morning? Okay. How did you, no breakfast, you just enough water, keeping alive, okay. How did you choose your breakfast? Was it like, food, right, and just stuff anything in your mouth? Was it this clear decision that, you know, you should eat something, it's healthy for you, this food is, you know, there to keep you alive, whether it's, you know, you're not necessarily eating it for the taste, but because you need it. You're eating just purely because it, did anyone out have chocolate cake for breakfast this morning? You wish you did. I wish I was in this game. Okay. Did anyone, so what did you have for breakfast? Tell me, people. That's a very personal matter.
McDonald's.
What did you have? McDonald's. So why was McDonald's the choice for you? Did you wake up with like McDonald's ads in your head? Was it just the closest thing?
It's on the way and convenient and cheap and delicious.
Okay. Okay. So let's look at this example. On the way is a real example. It's kind of complicated. It's delicious. Okay, there might be a bit of desire in here. Did you think about like how healthy is this for my breakfast?
I mean, small components.
Okay, small component.
I definitely don't eat it for the health benefits.
Okay. So what did you get?
Egg McMuffin and sausage McMuffin and hash brown.
Okay. So did you try to be a bit balanced or something?
Slightly, perhaps.
How clear were you with your decision, or were you just like, give me one of those?
Probably very clear.
Okay.
Before I went there, I already knew.
Okay, so we can say, you know, it seems to be not so ignorance. You kind of were clear about what you're doing. Wisdom, wise decision, that might be going too far. Could have maybe desire for the taste there. Okay, so, you know, any actual example is a bit complicated. Typically Buddhism says in any given moment, you can't have both wholesome and unwholesome states. But any real action doesn't take place in a single moment. And, you know, this whole decision to buy, action to buy, moving your body towards McDonald's, going, finding the line, standing in line, telling what you want. So you've got physical and verbal. You didn't just point at the menu. Okay. And then purchasing, for example, you know, we've already got all three types spanning at least several minutes, probably could be 5, 10, or minutes or even longer. You're going to have a whole bunch of these all coming in together. Right? So actual examples tend to be more like this. This combination of the two, really wholesome and unwholesome, you call it mixed karma. It's not purely wholesome or purely unwholesome. In reality, very, very few, if any, real actions are purely this or purely that. But some combination thereof, in Chinese like hei bai ye, black, white karma, sometimes called white karma, black karma. And then that's different from neutral. Okay? Important point. The wholesome and the unwholesome don't cancel each other out. They don't cancel each other out, unfortunately. We wish they did, right? Kind of binge purge. Oh, I bought really unhealthy breakfast today. Tomorrow I will buy a super healthy breakfast and then my health will be fine. It doesn't quite work like that, right? I drank a bottle of vodka last night, so today, no vodka, I'll drink a bottle of milk, and my health will be fine. No, it won't be fine, right? You've got the results of both a bottle of vodka and a bottle of milk. They don't just cancel each other out. A few of you are like, man. Yeah. Okay, so that's the ethical side. We can maybe talk about some actual examples in a minute. For now, though, it is 11 o'clock.